Good morning, everyone. This is a little strange because I'm looking at a picture of just me, like I'm looking in the mirror. I'm used to looking at all of the faces, so I'm actually talking to people. So, it'll work out. So, I'm going to be talking about my new book, Skating on Thin Ice, and I want to recount mostly several personal stories that will illustrate the main themes that are in the book. And then afterwards, I'll be happy to answer any questions or listen to any comments that you might have. The theme of skating on thin ice has been an influential force in my worldview ever since my very early 20s. When I remember I was living in New York and I read in the paper that there was a man on the rooftops who had a rifle and he was just indiscriminately shooting at people on the sidewalk. And I know that things like this are much more common these days, but then it was not common for this to happen. And when I read about it, I realized he was just killing people and for no reason. And the feeling of arbitrariness and uncertainty really struck me deeply at the time. I remember the feeling that something was just not right with life, that life was not supposed to be this way. And yet the uncertainty couldn't be denied. Perhaps you have felt something like this in your own life, where things may have seemed vaguely out of sync without really knowing why. I had a much more intense experience of the uncertainty of life in the early 70s. My former wife and I bought a property in Northern California, a house with some land, and we developed an extensive organic garden. We had goats for milk and we had chickens and sheep for meat. And we used to can and freeze the fruits and vegetables so we'd have organic food all year round. And we thought, this is a really nice life. This is how we wanted to raise our children. And it seemed like it was all going okay. We were there for 11 years. And then right at the end of the 11 years, my former wife and I got very sick with immune system diseases. And when they checked our blood, they found high levels of DDT in our blood. And as it turned out, the people who owned the property before us buried DDT in the soil. Apparently, it's just what people did in those days, because I guess DDT wasn't illegal yet. And so the DDT found its way into our bloodstream through the vegetables we were eating and through the meat we were raising. And the prolonged exposure to the DDT got us both very sick with serious and debilitating illness. And it's actually very ironic if you think about it. The effort to live a healthy, organic lifestyle, which we were doing for that long period of time, led to a chronic illness. So obviously, our effort to make our world safe and secure had failed. We had been unknowingly skating on the thin ice, and it really felt that way. And one thing we learned from this was how little control we actually had. As the saying goes, we're all just one doctor's visit away from falling into the icy water. So, in other words, no matter what we do and no matter how good our intentions may be, there's no way that we can guarantee to avoid the uncertainty of life and with all its adversity. And sometimes we might fall right into the icy water. It's a fact that human beings are security-seeking creatures. So it's natural that we want to develop strategies of behavior to try and ward off life's adversity, life's uncertainty. Early on, the strategy that I learned and developed to deal with adversity was one of trying to prove my own worth. And I want to illustrate with one story of how this came to be. Beginning in my teens, I worked for my father in his souvenir store on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, New Jersey. I worked there for over 10 years. When my father used to get angry when things weren't going well, or how he perceived things weren't going well, he was actually really very powerful. He would like let the anger build up, and then he would just explode by hollering at one of his children, usually at me. He would holler about how I wasn't trying, how I was just going through the motions. And the store would be full of people. There might have been 50, 60 people in the store at that point. And the customers were not used to someone screaming and hollering at their children. So they would freeze. And then my father would stomp out of the store, and all of the nervous customers would start buying stuff like crazy. And when I looked back on this, it was actually pretty humorous how the whole thing unfolded. But at the time, good humor was the farthest thing from my mind. So what I did to deal with my father and the whole situation was I started writing down my sales throughout the day, and then I'd add them up at the end of the day, and I show it to my father to show to him that I was measuring up, that I was proving my worth. And then over the years that followed, in many different situations, I continued the strategy of trying to prove that I was worthy. I felt that if I could tangibly demonstrate my success, my productivity, my value, that it would ward off uncertainty and the fear of being judged by others as unworthy. Now, of course, this strategy never really worked, although it did allow me to achieve external success in that it drove me to excel. It never really addressed the core fears. The core fears and all the day-to-day anxiety that rose out of those fears were really only put at bay temporarily. So over the years, as I realized that my strategy of trying to prove my worth, prove myself, that this strategy was limited, I realized I actually had to face my fears of failure, my fears of uncertainty. And when the realization came to me, I changed course. This was somewhere in my mid to late 20s. A friend of mine who I was talking to about this suggested that I needed to go directly against my fears. So very specifically, he suggested that I make up a song and go on Fisherman's Wharf and sing the song and then ask for money. In the summertime on Fisherman's Wharf, for those of you who are not familiar with it, there are usually scores of tourists milling around waiting to take the cable car. So he was asking me to basically go out and make a fool of myself in order to face my fear of humiliation. And I can remember even now, as long ago as this was, I could still remember standing there. I was petrified. I was trembling. I thought, maybe I'm going to faint. Maybe I'm going to throw up. But my motivation to go against my fear was very strong. So I sang the song and I asked for money. And surprisingly, people actually gave me money. And so then I sang it again, and I sang it again, maybe 3 or 4 times. And after I had sung it the last time, I was no longer afraid. But at this point, what I realized was this one effort was not going to help me conquer my fear or my anxieties. I realized I had to make efforts literally every day in order to go against my fearful patterns. Although I had majored in philosophy in college, and I had been a computer programmer at that time for a few years. But I made a decision to become a carpenter And this was actually quite a leap into the unknown. For one thing, at the time, I only weighed 120 pounds. And even more importantly, I had absolutely no carpentry skills. I didn't know what tools were. I didn't know how to do anything. Um, and I was very aware that I'd have to go out every day and face new and potentially difficult, potentially threatening situations. So this was my life for the next couple of years, daily going against my fears. So one example, one day they sent a group of us, regular carpenters. I was an apprentice carpenter at the time, out on a job to repair a beam in the ceiling of a factory. And so they put up a ladder, and I remember thinking that ladder's got to be at least 30 feet tall. And they didn't know I was afraid of heights. Anyway, I wasn't going to tell them that. So they told me to go up on the ladder and nail the beam, nail the support into the beam. So I started climbing the ladder. The ladder felt like it was shaking like jello. And when I got to the top, my hand was shaking so hard that I couldn't even hold a nail to nail it, the support into the beam. So the foreman screamed at me to come down off the ladder. And when I came down and looked around, I really couldn't even look anybody in the face. I was so humiliated. There were many, many examples of like this the first couple of years when I was working as an apprentice, where I felt humiliated because of my lack of skill, my lack of strength, just being really lost in what I was doing. But I was very motivated at the time to overcome my fears. And so I remember every morning I used to give myself a pep talk, telling myself that I had to buck up and just go out and face whatever situation would come my way. And even though I did go through with it, nonetheless, those first couple of years were very difficult. I had a teacher at the time, a meditation teacher, and she suggested to me that maybe I should stop seeing fear as the enemy that I had to confront and eradicate. And instead, maybe seeing fear as just part of being a human being. And maybe I could approach it with something like curiosity. And so she suggested that whenever fear or anxiety arose in situations, that instead of trying to go against it, I just ask myself a question. What is this experience right now? And then really stay present with the experience and feel what it was, physically feel it in the body, know what was going on in the mind. So here's a good example. Some time ago, during a period of intense illness, it was a continuation of what I had gotten from living on our organic farm. I used to have a blood test once a week for them to decide the degree I had to take medicine. And at the time, for whatever reason, the blood test used to unnerve me, and I'd get dizzy, and often I would even faint. And so one day, while driving to the lab, I remembered the instruction that my meditation teacher had given me about asking the question, what is this experience right now? So as soon as I sat in the chair in the lab, I just started asking myself silently the question, what is this experience? Really intently staying with the experience itself. And when they started to take the blood, at first I started to get dizzy, but instead of my normal response, which was anxiety and aversion, I was actually curious and excited to find out what fainting would actually feel like. And so I kept asking the question. They took my blood, and of course, I didn't faint. And actually, I was sitting there quite at ease. And what happened was, by no longer resisting my experience and really just wanting to feel whatever was there, not only did the anxiety disappear, but the physical experience transformed as well, in that the dizziness, the fainting, the anxiety all just really disappeared. So the teaching that I learned from this, when fear or any other difficult or unpleasant emotion arises, is essentially to say yes to it. Saying yes doesn't mean that you like the experience. It doesn't mean that you accept the experience. What it means is you're saying, yes, I am willing to face and to feel what this experience is right now. Learning to say yes to my experience was a crucial teaching for me at the time and has continued to be ever since. And it also helped me to cultivate living a life that was more oriented towards gratitude. So, for example, one day on a trip that Elizabeth and I took to Paris, it was our first day there, and I started to get flu-like symptoms, including a really bad sore throat. And when we went out for a walk, we were walking over to Notre Dame Cathedral. It started raining. And so it started like going on in my head, all these thoughts about how I was going to be sick and it was going to be raining for our whole trip in Paris and it was going to be ruined. And so we're sitting in Notre Dame Cathedral. I'm having these thoughts. And then I remembered, fortunately, I remembered the practice that I had learned of rather than being caught in my own anxiety and my own head, to instead try and really stay present with whatever my experience was in the moment. And when I did stay present with the experience, the sore throat just turned into mildly unpleasant uh, sensations. It was no longer something horrible like a really bad sore throat. But even more importantly, what I realized by staying with my experience, that I was sitting next to Elizabeth in one of the most beautiful churches in Paris. And so the experience opened up a well of gratitude just by staying with it, sore throat and all. It was by getting out of my head and surrendering to the present moment experience, saying yes to my present moment experience, that this came about. So, along with trying to be present, cultivating gratitude have become two of the main aspects of my spiritual path. And I want to give an example of the effect that this had on me. Several years ago, Elizabeth and I took a trip to northern Italy. We were staying at Lake Como. And I remember that we used to take walks every day through these idyllic little towns. We used to eat pasta at almost every meal. We sat in a different church every day and meditated. And it was a wonderful, wonderful trip. And I remember feeling so happy that we had the health and the resources to be able to have an experience like this. But as soon as we got back to San Diego, Elizabeth got the diagnosis that she had breast cancer. And very shortly after that, we found out that she immediately had to have a mastectomy. Interestingly, even though Elizabeth had to have a mastectomy, she had very little melodrama about it. But for me, it felt like the ground was pulled out right from under me. And in spite of my many years of working with my own illness, I couldn't deny the fact that I was still caught up in the illusion that somehow both of us had endless time. I know it may sound somewhat crazy, but in a way, I think this illusion is something that all of us have to some degree. We're convinced that our life will continue, perhaps indefinitely, into the vague future. Maybe for most of us, like I was, we're rarely aware of the extent to which this belief, this illusion, keeps us skating on the thin ice, oblivious of the fact that our lives can change or be altered at any time without any notice, without any warning. I imagine some of you may have experienced this in your own life. As we increasingly become aware that we and our loved ones do, in fact, have limited time, we're bound to have moments where we feel disconnected, where we feel uncertainty. I certainly felt the uncertainty and the fear of loss when Elizabeth was diagnosed with breast cancer. And as a result, from that time on, I have made it a point to never take Elizabeth for granted. And even more so, to always try to treat her, and in fact, to treat everyone with kindness. Aspiring to live from kindness and from gratitude have become crucial parts of my own path of self-realization. And so I want to just give you this one interesting thought as we near the end of this talk. I read this somewhere and I thought it was great. The Pacific Ocean outside our door doesn't care how much money we have. The nearby mountains couldn't care less about my appearance. The California poppies keep growing regardless of my social status. So with this in mind, while it's a fact that we're all skating on the thin ice, hopefully we could turn away from our petty thoughts and our petty behaviors, as well as our anxious thoughts, imaginary thoughts about the future, and instead realize the value in trying to stay present, including staying present to our fears, the fears that prevent us from living from kindness and from gratitude. The message of fear is to close down and defend. But the message of the heart is to open and connect. Whenever we give into fear, in a way, we lose our life. And until we become intimate with our fears, they'll always limit our ability to love. However, once we learn to face our fears, and that means to be able to say yes to feeling them, then we're more likely to be grateful for all of the good things that may be in our life that we very often take for granted. So I still have fear arise on occasion and also uncertainty, but they no longer dictate my life. They no longer fill up my inner space or require me to find answers to them. In fact, perhaps we can take comfort in understanding the wisdom that there are no big answers that are going to explain the mystery of life or take away our fears or take away our dark nights. But learning to be present, learning to say yes to life, even in its uncertainty, and also cultivating gratitude and kindness is certainly a good start. So that's probably enough for a basic overview of the book, although there's much more in it than I've talked about right now. And perhaps at this point, there'll be questions. I asked Mark Evans to explain the logistics for asking questions. So Mark, do you want to take over?
Sure, Ezra. First of all, I really enjoyed the talk very much. Thank you for that. There are two different ways to pose questions. One is to, if you prefer to type them out, you can use the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Alternatively, if you want to ask a question orally, at the very bottom of again, at the Zoom screen over towards the right, you'll see a little icon that says raise hand. Just click on that, as Sharon did some point earlier on, I think maybe before Ezra started, and I'll find out whether she does have a question. And the way I'll do that is I will ask her to unmute, and then hopefully, Sharon, you will unmute, and then you'll tell us whether you have a question. Maybe Sharon's sleeping. Ezra, while we're waiting, let me ask a question, if I may. Um, in your talk as well as in the book, there are sort of two themes that seem to run through them. One is, well, as you talked about today, sort of your effort to conquer your fear. I think you may be suggesting by the end of the talk that maybe you're no longer feeling the need to do that. But there's also this sense of perseverance and aspiration that kind of runs through the book. At the same time, there's a very strong uh, theme of letting it be. And is there a tension between those two themes?
I don't, it's a great question, Mark. I don't know if there's a tension between them, but it is a paradox that there is great emphasis on the theme of just letting life be. For example, just staying with your breath and feeling the texture of the moment. And at the same time, when we see things that need to be addressed, sometimes we need to address them through what you could call skillful practice. So, as I said in the talk early on, I addressed the fear, I believe, at this point in my life, unskillfully by trying to confront it and eradicate it. And like you just said, I no longer feel the need when fear arises to try and get rid of it or eradicate it. I'm willing to say, oh, here it is again. What's it going to feel like this time? And really just stay with it. And in a sense, that combines the sense of effort or aspiration along with letting life just be, because I'm not trying to change the fear. I'm not trying to get rid of the fear. I'm willing to just feel what it is. The interesting thing about this is when we are willing to not resist anymore and really feel our experience, often it will change on its own. And this has been my experience many, many times over the years.
Chuck asks the question, will the book be available in the fitness center store? You know, the little, what's it called? Treasure chest.
I could put some books in there. That'll be, and it'll also be available in the library. And if anybody wants to order it, they could get it either from Amazon or from Constellation Press. The paperback's out now, and I believe the Kindle version will be out in a couple days on the 15th. Anybody else?
Carol has a question.
Hi, Ezra. That was very inspirational. What I got a hold of was a process, a continuing process that started at some point in your life, probably the very beginning, that you have embraced along the way and apparently have had milestones and maybe models that, as Mark said, embedded this perseverance that you described. Can you talk a little about touchstones that have moved you and maybe people in particular?
The interesting thing is that I actually don't know why people will pursue spiritual practice or persevere with spiritual practice, and why some people have no interest in it or drop out when it gets difficult. I know when I've had students over the years, I've been wrong so many times thinking, oh, that student is going to stay with this practice for her lifetime, and then they leave after a few months. And then other people, I think, well, this person is never going to do anything in this practice. They're I don't want to say anything bad about them, but I just thought they're never going to make it in this practice, and they end up being really, really good students and last for years. So about why one person perseveres and why another person doesn't persevere, to me, that is a mystery. But I do think over the years, for me at least, it's been absolutely necessary to have models. I've had 3 different teachers, each of which I've had for at least 12, 13 years, who I've learned a great deal from. And with each one of them, I felt after I had learned what I could learn from them, it was time to move on and I found a different teacher who taught me new things. So it may be different for other people. I don't know how anyone would get through this difficult life of trying to find inner harmony and inner peace without help from other people. Sometimes even help from being in a group is really worthwhile. But everybody has their own path, so I can't say there's like one path that would work for everyone. I don't know if I answered what you were asking, Carol.
Yes.
So,
Thank you.
okay.
Buzz.
Ezra, I've got your book and I've just started it, so I'm working my way through it. But I was just curious. I found at various times that there is a power in work. And by that I mean that there are some fears that you face because you need to do something and you're worried about whether you can do it or not, or how it will turn out, or a bunch of things that occur to you before you start doing it, before you start trying to do it. And the act of will, perhaps it is, of sitting down and starting it, and then persisting and trying to work through it itself relieves a great deal of stress. I mean, it's not just experiencing, being there and experiencing the fear or the feel of where am I now, but it's actually the power in doing something about it. How does that, or does it at all, fit into what you're saying?
Well, it is a fact that if you can work through your experience of fear that seems like it's holding you back, you can power through it. I actually did that for many years in the beginning as a carpenter. I would have my fear, but I would still just go ahead and do all these tasks that seemed impossible at the time. But of course, they were doable eventually. The problem with that approach, from my experience, is that you're not really addressing the depth of the fear that still remains on board. It's true, you could just start working through them, but the fear remains. And my interest at the time was to get to really the root of the fear itself and address that. And one thing about what you said, Buzz, the practice of saying yes to fear and really just feeling what it is doesn't mean that you don't take action or do something. If you have a situation where you are afraid, you still have to go through whatever it takes to do the action. But what I'm suggesting is, as you approach that situation, or maybe periodically during it, you maybe try and remember to just pause, take a breath, say, yes, I'm willing to feel this, instead of trying to power through it and eradicate it. And it's really quite a different experience. And my suggestion is just try this out and see if you find it helpful, if you find it interesting.
Elizabeth, the co-star of today's presentation, is on the line too.
Ezra, thank you so much. It's wonderful reading the book, and I know that you didn't write it to be published. You wrote it for yourself, just to examine what you had learned and what might have become dormant or been lost along the way. And then you realize that it might be helpful to other people. But I was wondering, who is your ideal reader?
Well, it's true that when I started writing, I was just writing for myself. I didn't have any intention to publish. I just wanted to remember what was important in my life, big things, little things, especially all of the experiences that I had, like the stories that I told in today's talk. I wanted to remember those because they had an emotional import for me. And when I maybe was halfway through writing down all these things, I realized maybe this stuff would be helpful for other people. And so I think at that point, the ideal reader for me would have been someone who maybe felt that something was missing in their life, that there must be more to living than had thus far been attained. So it's a feeling, like I mentioned earlier in the talk, that something's vaguely out of sync with your life, but maybe you don't know exactly what it is. And if someone has this feeling, this longing, this sense of inner search, and if also they're open to learning, which is really the most crucial thing, if they're open to learning, then I think this book would be helpful for them, could be helpful for them. And that's who I would hope would be reading it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Chuck, oh, you didn't, you're muted again. Let me ask you to unmute again. There you go.
Ezra, I recall you talked to me one time about being a contractor in Marin County and making the transition from a carpenter to a general contractor sounds scary to me. And I'm wondering if you would say a little bit about that, or if maybe that's one of the items in your book and I can wait and read it.
Well, I don't address that particular. I'm thinking I actually became a contractor 3 years after I became a carpenter. And I know at the time I was still working through my understanding of how to best address the fears that I would have. So I can't remember exactly, Chuck, but there's no doubt that it was scary for me to go from wearing a tool belt to becoming a contractor and doing things for much more higher stakes, financial stakes, and like that. But over the years, as I continued as a contractor, because I was a carpenter and a contractor for 30 years, I did learn, maybe around halfway through that, the practice of saying yes to fear, the practice of being willing to feel it instead of fighting it. And I remember my experience as a contractor became much, much easier because I wasn't having to deal fighting myself anymore. I just had to deal with subcontractors and owners and just the normal stuff that you deal with as a contractor. But the practice that I talked about very definitely helped me in that transition.
Are there other questions?
Or if any of you have any comments that you'd like to make.
Looks like, even though I said I wasn't going to see him, I happened to see, we'll
Bob,
see.
Bob has his hand up.
I know, but, so go ahead, Bob.
I don't have a question. I'm intrigued by how personal the book or the talk was. So now I'm going to get the book expecting a pretty personal book, which I'm looking forward to. As interesting as all the technical things about Zen are, to me, it's such a personal thing that personal stories resonate more with me. So thank you.
Okay, well, actually, this is not a book so much on Zen as it is on just what I consider to be just intelligent way to approach life. And I put Zen in the subtitle because my publisher thought it was a really good idea. Maybe it would help sell the book. But and my training has been in Zen. But you're right, a lot of the book is about based on what I learned through my own life experiences. And I felt talking about my experiences would make it much more clear the points that I was trying to get across. So I hope you do get something out of it, Bob.
Thank you. I will. I'll
Okay.
get the book. I'm sure. I look forward to it.
Okay.
Mary and Roger.
Yeah, I have a comment, Ezra. What a lovely half hour this has been, and I thank you for sharing those very personal growth spurts that you had. It reminds me very much of the sensation of grief. If you substitute the word grief for the word fear, I think you perhaps handle things about the same way as you handled fears. And I think for our age group, this is something that we can apply to ourselves and our loved ones.
Mary, I agree with you almost completely. And I would add one thing to that, that there is a whole section on dealing with grief. Many of us in this audience, like you say, have had much, maybe have had much grief in our life already. There are special ways of dealing with grief that I'm not talking about here today. And if you do read the book, I hope you could find it helpful. Facing grief, of course, is always helpful, but there's also some very specific things to do with it. So keep that in mind. Okay. I see Dan has a hand up.
Yep.
Thanks for the talk, Ezra. This may be a little bit philosophical of a question, but it seems like, and my book is arriving today, by the way, so I haven't had a chance to read it, but it seems like the core of what you're saying is the practice is a tool towards the ultimate values of presence, love, and gratitude. Is that roughly, am I sort of getting that roughly right?
Roughly, that's right. It's about, I would add one thing to it. It's learning to live from presence, which would lead to living a life of kindness and gratitude and love and connectedness, and which are, to me, the most important things. That's why I don't care about calling this Zen, because usually those things aren't mentioned too much in Zen. But yes, that is the ultimate purpose of the practice. Did you want to say any more about that, Dan? I can't see you.
I have to get him to unmute again before he can answer.
Sorry, I muted, and then I was muted by my father.
Oh, I didn't.
Not intentionally, I'm sure, but
I did not mute you.
No, that makes sense. So right, so that makes sense. If I have other questions, I'll follow up with you later.
Okay.
Carol.
Ezra, I'm thinking as we talk about process again, that's a hot subject around here right now. And I'm thinking that this book, what I'm asking is this book another touchstone that began and is like singing the song on the pier, and how far you've come with that song to publishing this book? Because you said you had a reticence about, or maybe no sense that it needed to be published, and you've changed your mind.
Yeah. Well, the actual writing of the book, especially in the early months, definitely would be considered a touchstone, because what I was doing, I actually read through my prior 7 books and wrote down what I thought was important from them, and put that all kind of started to put that all together. And that was, in a way, I never thought of it like this, but that was in a way like singing the song on Fisherman's Wharf, and that it was a step in the direction that I wanted to be going. The publishing of the book, the selling of the book, I don't consider that a touchstone. That's just practical stuff, whether the book sells or not, whether people like it or not. That's not part of what was important to me at the time. What was important to me was really remembering what I had learned and what I'm still learning, and using the book to continue learning. In fact, something happened, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, where I felt a degree of distress about something. I don't remember what it was. And I went directly to the book and went to a chapter on working with fear to remind myself of just the ABCs, the Cliff's Notes version of what I knew, because just temporarily I had forgotten. And so in that sense, it's an ongoing process for me. And I know we're running over the time, but if there's maybe one more question and then we'd end. Or if not, we'll just end. And I want to thank everybody for coming and also for participating. I do have the thought of giving this, again, for those of you who are in the meditation group that meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11, I'm thinking of giving this talk again, but in a different way. I'm going to give it while you're meditating. I'll be giving a particular meditation that you can be doing while I'm talking, and it'll be an interesting experiment for those of you who could make it. In the meantime, thank you very much for coming.